Close your eyes. Picture a soldier from the Great War. You probably see a hero in a clean uniform, bayonet fixed, charging bravely across a field. You see courage, honor, and a noble cause. It's a powerful image, crafted by a century of movies and memorials. That image is a lie, a comforting, simple, and heroic lie. The reality for the average soldier was a world of mud, steel, gas, and rats. It was a brutal, industrial process of human destruction. The real question isn't how bravely you would fight. It's how long you would survive. So let's enlist you. The year is 1916. A man with a grand mustache on a poster tells you your country needs you. Your friends are all going. It's an adventure. They say it will all be over by Christmas. You believe them. Everyone does. You're handed a uniform and a rifle. The training is basic. You learn to march, to shoot, and to follow orders without question. You feel strong, part of something bigger than yourself. You are packed onto a train, then a boat. The mood is high. You sing songs and share cigarettes, dreaming of glory in France. Then you arrive. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the enemy, it's the sound. A constant, low rumble in the distance, like a thunderstorm that never ends. It's the sound of the front line, and it's the soundtrack to the rest of your short life. Your march towards the trenches. The landscape changes. The green fields and quaint villages disappear. They are replaced by a brown, scarred wasteland of craters, shattered trees, and the tangled skeletons of barbed wire. The air itself feels heavy, thick with a strange chemical smell you can't quite place. Then you see the trenches for the first time. They are not the neat, orderly ditches you imagined. They are chaotic, muddy gashes in the earth, reinforced with rotting wood and sandbags. Men with hollow, thousand-yard stares move slowly through them, their faces caked in grime. This is your new home. You are assigned to a section of the line. A veteran, a man who looks 50 but is probably 22, gives you the rules. Keep your head down. Don't look over the top during the day. The snipers are always watching. Always. He doesn't smile when he says it. The first night is the worst. The distant rumble you heard is now a series of deafening explosions that shake the very ground you stand on. The sky is lit by the eerie, pulsing glow of flares, which cast long, dancing shadows and turn the landscape into a nightmare. You learn the different sounds. The whistle of a sniper's bullet is a sharp crack. The incoming artillery shells have a mournful shriek that grows louder and louder until the world erupts in fire and earth. You learn to make yourself small, to press yourself into the mud and pray. Let's talk about the mud. It is more than just dirt and water. It is a thick, greedy, inescapable substance. It is a soup of clay, human waste, rotting sandbags, and the remains of men and animals. It pulls at your boots with every step, trying to claim you. This mud is your constant companion. It cakes your uniform, gets into your food, and fills your lungs. In the winter, it freezes solid, creating treacherous, icy pathways. In the rain, it becomes a liquid tide that can flood trenches and drown sleeping men in their dugouts. The mud also brings disease. Specifically, it brings trench foot. Your feet are constantly wet inside your leather boots. After days of this, the skin begins to break down. It becomes numb, then turns red or blue as the tissue begins to die. The swelling is immense. If you are lucky, you get your boots off to find your feet have swollen to twice their normal size, the skin sloughing off. If you are unlucky, gangrene sets in. The flesh turns black and rots. The smell is something you will never forget. Amputation is often the only cure. Now let's talk about your roommates. They are not the brave comrades from the songs. They are rats. Not normal rats. These are huge, bloated creatures, grown fat on the battlefield's endless supply of food. They are bold, fearless, and everywhere. They are the true kings of this wasteland. At night, they crawl over you as you try to sleep. They steal your rations, gnawing through your pack to get at a biscuit. The veterans will tell you stories, their voices low and grim, of how the rats will eat the eyes of the dead before anything else. And if the rats weren't enough, there is the lice. Everyone has them. They are a torment, living in the seams of your uniform. They cause a constant maddening itch that can drive a man insane. The scratching leaves you with sores that often become infected in the filth. The soldiers call it chatting. You and your comrades will sit with a lit candle, running it along the seams of your shirt to hear the satisfying pop of the lice and their eggs bursting in the flame. It's a brief moment of relief in a sea of constant discomfort. Let's discuss your diet. The main course, day in and day out, is bully beef, a tinned corned beef. You also get hardtack biscuits, which are so hard they can break teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get bread, cheese, or jam, but mostly, it's the beef and the biscuit. The food is monotonous, tasteless, and often contaminated by the mud and the conditions it's stored in. Fresh water is a luxury. Often, the only water available is from shell holes, floating with chemicals and death. You drink it anyway, because you are desperate. Welcome to the front. Now, let's truly settle into your new reality. The initial shock is over, replaced by a grim, soul-crushing routine. Your life is measured not in days or weeks, but in rotations. A few days on the front line, a few days in the support trenches, and if you are incredibly fortunate, a few days in the rear to rest. But rest is a relative term. The sound of the guns is still there, a constant reminder that your return to the meat grinder is inevitable. The enemy is not just the soldier in the opposing trench. The true enemies are exhaustion, exposure, and the grinding, relentless boredom that fills the long hours between moments of terror. This boredom is a psychological poison. It gives you too much time to think about the shelling, about the friends you've lost, about the sheer statistical improbability of your own survival. Let's talk about that boredom in more detail, because it's a killer in its own right. You stand guard for hours on a fire step, staring through a periscope at the same stretch of churned-up earth and tangled wire. You see nothing. You hear nothing but the wind and the distant guns. Then you spend hours filling sandbags, the rough burlap scraping your hands raw. You dig, deepening the trench, repairing a wall collapsed by rain or a shell. It is mindless, repetitive physical labor that serves only to maintain your own prison. You write letters home, but you can't describe the reality. How do you explain the smell of rot and cordite to your mother? How do you describe the feeling of a near-miss shell to your sweetheart? So you lie. You say you are well, that the food is good, and that you will be home soon. The daily attrition is the most insidious threat. You are not safe even when nothing is happening. A sniper's bullet can find you at any moment. The enemy snipers are patient, skilled professionals who watch your lines for hours, waiting for a single mistake, a head raised too high, a careless silhouette against the skyline. You learn to move in a crouch, to never use the same spot twice. But the greatest danger comes from the sky. Artillery is the king of this battlefield. The shells are random and impersonal. A single high-explosive shell can obliterate a section of trench, burying you and your friends alive in an instant. There is no defense against it. You can be asleep in your dugout, writing a letter, or eating your ration of bully beef, and in a flash you simply cease to exist. This is how most soldiers died, not in a heroic charge, but randomly, anonymously, torn apart by a shell fired from miles away by someone you will never see. Let's imagine you survive the daily grind. Then comes the order. It passes down the line in hushed, nervous whispers. You're going over the top. An attack is planned. The atmosphere in the trench changes instantly. The boredom is gone, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning dread. You are given extra ammunition and grenades. Some men are given wire cutters. You are handed a last letter to write, just in case. You sit in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting. You check your rifle a dozen times. You try to smoke a cigarette, but your hands are shaking too much. You look at the faces of the men around you. Some are pale and quiet, lost in prayer or thought. Others make nervous jokes, their laughter sounding brittle and hollow in the tense air. This waiting is a unique form of torture, a slow, agonizing countdown to what you know is almost certain death. The prelude to the attack is a massive artillery barrage. For hours, sometimes days, your own guns fire relentlessly at the enemy lines. The noise is a physical force, a continuous, deafening roar that makes it impossible to think or speak. It's meant to destroy the enemy's barbed wire and machine gun nests, and to demoralize their soldiers. But you know that the enemy is doing the same thing to your trenches. Your world becomes a vibrating hell of noise, concussion, and flying dirt. You huddle in your dugout, praying the structure holds, as the earth heaves around you. The barrage is supposed to make your job easier, but you also know that it serves as a giant, unmistakable announcement to the enemy. An attack is coming. They know you are coming. They are waiting. Then, the barrage lifts. The sudden silence is more terrifying than the noise. In that silence, you hear a single, sharp sound, an officer's whistle. That is the signal. It's time. All along the line, men are clambering up ladders, their bayonets fixed. You take a deep breath, and you climb out of the relative safety of the trench into the open. You are in no man's land. It is a place beyond imagination. The ground is a lunar landscape of overlapping shell craters, some of them filled with stagnant, foul-smelling water. The air is thick with smoke and the metallic tang of explosives. The shattered stumps of trees reach up like skeletal fingers. And everywhere, there is the wire, thick tangled webs of barbed wire, miraculously uncut by the barrage, waiting to snag you and hold you in place. The moment you emerge, the enemy machine guns open up. The sound is like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas, a rapid, mechanical thump, thump, thump that scythes through the air. You are ordered to walk, not run, to maintain formation. But men around you are dropping. They fall silently, or with a short, surprised cry. They are not shot cleanly. The high-caliber bullets tear through them, ripping them apart. You see a man beside you stumble, a line of red holes appearing across his chest. You keep walking, stepping over the bodies of the dead and the wounded. The noise is overwhelming. The machine guns, the shouting of officers, the screams of the dying, and the renewed thunder of enemy artillery shells landing amongst you. Your grand adventure has become a slow, methodical walk into a wall of flying steel. Let's introduce a new horror, one that defines this war. As you struggle through no man's land, you hear a new sound, a strange clanging gong or a blaring horn. It's the gas alarm. A yellowish-green cloud is drifting slowly towards you across the battlefield, hugging the ground. This is chlorine gas. You fumble frantically for your gas mask, a primitive hood with fragile eyepieces and a filter. You pull it on, and the world becomes muffled and dim. Your breathing is labored, hot, and claustrophobic. The mask smells of rubber and chemicals. You see other men who weren't fast enough. They are choking, clutching their throats, their faces turning blue as the gas burns their lungs from the inside out. They drown on dry land, their bodies convulsing in agony. The terror of gas is not just the death it brings, but its silent, insidious nature. It is a weapon that hunts you in your trench, seeking you out in the deepest dugout. There were other types of gas, each with its own special brand of terror. Phosgene was more subtle than chlorine. It was often colorless and had a faint smell like moldy hay. You might breathe it in without realizing the danger. The effects came hours later. A man would seem fine after an attack, only to suddenly collapse, his lungs filling with fluid, suffocating him from within. But the most feared was mustard gas. It was not always lethal, but its effects were monstrous. It was a blistering agent. Wherever the oily, vaporous liquid touched skin, it caused massive, painful blisters. It burned the eyes, causing temporary or permanent blindness. Worst of all, it lingered in the soil for weeks. A soldier could take shelter in a shell hole, only to be burned by the gas that had settled there days before. It was a persistent, invisible poison that made the very ground you fought on your enemy. But let's say you are one of the impossibly lucky ones. You cross no man's land. You navigate the wire and avoid the machine guns. You survive the gas. You reach the enemy trench. What you find is not a line of cowering, defeated soldiers. You find men just like you, who have endured the same bombardment, who are just as terrified and just as determined to survive. The fight becomes a primal, medieval horror. It's a chaotic mess of bayonets, trench clubs, sharpened shovels and pistols. It happens in a narrow, muddy ditch with no room to maneuver. It is brutal, intimate, and exhausting. You are no longer a soldier in an army. You are an animal fighting for your life in a pit. There is no glory here. There is only the desperate, frantic need to kill before you are killed. Let's pause on the idea of the enemy. The propaganda posters back home showed them as monstrous, evil Huns. But here, in the filth of a captured trench, you see the truth. You see their personal belongings scattered about, letters from their families, photographs of their wives and children. You see the same cheap tins of food, the same worn-out equipment. And when you look into the eyes of a captured soldier, you don't see a monster. You see a young man, just as scared and exhausted as you are. You begin to realize the profound, tragic absurdity of it all. The man you are trying to kill is living the exact same nightmare as you, just a few hundred yards away. This realization doesn't make it easier to fight. It makes it harder. It hollows you out, replacing patriotic fervor with a deep, weary sadness. There were moments when this shared humanity broke through the madness. The most famous is the Christmas truce of 1914, when soldiers from both sides spontaneously laid down their arms to share gifts and sing carols in no man's land. But smaller, unspoken truces happened all the time. There might be an informal live and let live system on a quiet sector of the front. Soldiers might deliberately fire high, or tacitly agree not to shell the enemy's latrines during certain hours. These were small acts of sanity in an insane world, a recognition that the true enemy wasn't the man in the other trench, but the war itself. The high command hated these moments of fraternization and quickly stamped them out with threats of execution, but they proved that the hatred required to fight such a war had to be constantly and artificially enforced. Now, let's consider the psychological toll. Your brain is not designed for this. The constant threat of death, the relentless noise, the horrific sights, and the loss of your friends all begin to break you down. This condition was called shell shock. At the time, it was poorly understood. Many in command dismissed it as cowardice or a lack of moral fiber. But it was a very real injury, a wound to the mind. The symptoms were devastating. Some men were plagued by uncontrollable tremors, their bodies shaking for hours on end. Others were struck mute, unable to speak, or deaf, unable to hear. Many suffered from terrifying nightmares and hallucinations, reliving the horrors of battle over and over. They were haunted by the thousand-yard stare, a vacant, unfocused gaze that looked right through you, seeing only the horrors they had witnessed. The treatment for shell shock was often as brutal as the condition itself. Men were sent to hospitals far from the front, where doctors, with little understanding of post-traumatic stress, employed harsh and sometimes punitive methods. Some used disciplinary treatments, believing they could shock the soldier out of his condition with shaming, isolation, or painful electric shock therapy. The goal was not to heal the man, but to get him back to the front as quickly as possible. For many soldiers, the psychological wounds of the war would never heal. They would carry the trenches inside them for the rest of their lives, long after the guns fell silent. They came home as changed men, distant and haunted, unable to connect with a world that could never understand what they had been through. Let's say you are physically wounded. This could be a blighty wound, a wound serious enough to get you sent back to Britain, or blighty, as the soldiers called it. For many, getting wounded was the only honorable way out, a lottery ticket to survival. But the wound itself is just the beginning of another ordeal. First, you have to survive long enough to be found. You might lie for hours in a shell hole in no man's land, bleeding, in agonizing pain, listening to the battle rage around you. The stretcher bearers are the unsung heroes of the war. They were often conscientious objectors or men unfit for combat, and their job was to venture into the deadliest places on the battlefield, unarmed, to rescue the wounded. Their casualty rates were astronomical. If you are rescued, you begin a long, torturous journey. You are taken to a regimental aid post, a cramped, dirty dugout just behind the front lines. Here, a medical officer performs basic triage, giving you a shot of morphine and applying a field dressing. The conditions are appalling. The operating table might be a simple wooden plank laid over 2 barrels. The doctor works by candlelight, surrounded by the dead and dying. From there, you are moved to a casualty clearing station, a large tent or series of huts a few miles back. This is the first place where real surgery might happen, but the sheer number of casualties was overwhelming. Doctors and nurses worked to the point of collapse, performing hundreds of amputations and surgeries a day. The ground outside the surgery tent was often piled high with amputated limbs. The nature of the wounds was horrific. High-explosive shells and machine gun bullets didn't just pierce the body, they shattered it. They tore flesh, pulverized bone, and carried dirt and pieces of uniform deep into the wound, causing massive infections. Before the widespread use of antibiotics, infection was one of the biggest killers. Tetanus and gas gangrene were rampant. Gas gangrene was particularly hideous, a fast-moving infection that caused tissues to swell with gas and dye, turning the skin black and bubbly. The only treatment was radical surgery, cutting away all infected tissue or amputating the limb entirely. Even if you survived the surgery, your ordeal was not over. You would then be placed on a hospital train for a long, jolting ride to a base hospital on the coast, and from there, a ship back home. Many men died on this journey. And what if you survive it all? You survive the trenches, the attacks, the gas, the diseases, and the psychological strain. You make it to the armistice in 1918. The guns finally fall silent. You are sent home. You expect a hero's welcome. But what you find is a world that has moved on, a world that doesn't understand. People see your uniform and thank you for your service, but they cannot possibly comprehend the reality you have endured. They still believe in the glorious lie. They ask you what it was like, and you have no words to describe it. How do you explain the smell of a trench or the sound of a man screaming for his mother in no man's land to someone who has only known peace and safety? You feel a profound sense of alienation, a gulf between you and the civilian world that can never be bridged. So, how long would you survive? The statistics are cold and unforgiving. The average life expectancy of a junior officer, a second lieutenant, on the front lines of the Western Front could be as short as 6 weeks. For the enlisted man, it was a lottery. Survival was not about courage or skill, it was about luck. It was about which section of the line you were assigned to, whether you were sick when your unit went over the top, or whether an artillery shell happened to land 10 feet to your left instead of 10 feet to your right. You were a tiny, fragile human component in a vast, impersonal machine of industrial warfare. Your individual existence was a statistical rounding error in the grand, bloody arithmetic of attrition. The romantic myth of the great war soldier, the brave hero charging to victory, is a profound disservice to the men who actually fought it. Their story is not one of glory. It is a story of endurance. It is the story of ordinary men forced to endure the unendurable. They survived not just the enemy, but the mud, the rats, the lice, the disease, the terror, the boredom, and the madness. The true measure of their strength was not how they died, but how they managed, against all odds, to live, day after agonizing day, in a world that had been meticulously designed to kill them. That is the real history, a quiet, grim, and far more heroic story than the lie we were told. Let us return to a single fundamental element, the noise. It is impossible to overstate its psychological impact. The war was never silent. Even on a quiet day, there was a constant background hum. The distant rolling thunder of artillery from another sector, the crack of a sniper's rifle, the drone of a reconnaissance plane overhead. Your ears were always on high alert, straining to interpret each sound. Was that shell incoming or outgoing? Was that a rifle shot or just a piece of wood snapping in the trench wall? This constant auditory tension frayed the nerves, making true rest impossible. Sleep was not a peaceful escape. It was a shallow, fitful state, easily broken by a sudden explosion or the frantic shouts of a sentry. Many soldiers developed a permanent ringing in their ears that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, a constant, ghostly echo of the front. The artillery bombardments were a class of noise all their own, a symphony of destruction. You learned to distinguish the different sounds, the quick, barking report of your own field guns behind you, the deep, guttural roar of the heavy howitzers. But the most terrifying was the sound of an incoming shell. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible whistle in the distance. Like an approaching train, it grew steadily in pitch and volume, a mournful, rising shriek that seemed to drill directly into your brain. In those few seconds, time would slow down. There was nothing you could do but throw yourself flat, press your face into the mud, and wait. The final moment was a deafening, earth-shattering crump that felt like the world was being torn apart. The ground would leap beneath you, and a rain of dirt, shrapnel, and debris would fall from the sky, and then you would wait for the next one. Let's consider the simple act of eating. It was a ritual of misery. Your main ration, the infamous bully beef, was a fatty, gelatinous corned beef that you would eat cold, straight from the tin. It was greasy and unappetizing, but it was calories. It was survival. The other staple was the hardtack biscuit. These were not the crackers you know today. They were unleavened, incredibly dense flour and water biscuits, baked to be as hard as a rock to prevent spoilage. They were notoriously difficult to eat. Soldiers would try to soak them in tea or water, but often the only way to get through one was to smash it with a rifle butt or a rock and eat the pieces. Many a soldier cracked a tooth on a hardtack biscuit. It was a constant reminder of how little comfort or care was afforded to the men who were expected to make the ultimate sacrifice. And then there was the water. Clean drinking water was one of the most precious and scarce commodities in the trenches. It was brought up to the front line in petrol cans by carrying parties, usually at night. The cans were often not cleaned properly, so the water would have a foul taste of gasoline. But it was better than the alternative. The landscape was dotted with water-filled shell craters. This water looked tempting, but it was a death sentence. It was stagnant and polluted with every imaginable horror: human and animal waste, decomposing bodies, cordite from the shells, and the lingering residue of gas attacks. Men who were desperate enough to drink from these pools would almost invariably contract dysentery or cholera. These diseases, with their violent sickness and diarrhea, could kill a man as surely as a bullet, but in a much slower, more agonizing, and undignified way. Let's talk about your living quarters. The dugout sounds like it might offer some protection, but the quality varied wildly. A good dugout, usually found in a well-established, quiet sector, might be relatively deep, shored up with thick wooden beams, and might even have makeshift beds. But on an active or newly captured part of the front, your dugout was likely just a small hole scraped into the side of the trench wall, barely big enough to crawl into. It offered minimal protection from anything but the rain. These shallow burrows were damp, cold, and often infested with rats. They were also death traps. A direct hit from an artillery shell would not just destroy the dugout, it would collapse it, burying the occupants alive under tons of earth. The fear of being buried alive was a constant gnawing anxiety for every soldier. The social structure of the trench was a world unto itself. You lived in incredibly close quarters with a small group of men. You saw them at their best and at their absolute worst. You learned everything about them, their families, their hopes, their fears. These men became closer to you than brothers. This bond, this comradeship, was the single most important factor in a soldier's mental survival. It was the reason you kept going. You didn't fight for the king or for patriotism. You fought for the man standing next to you. You endured the horror because he was enduring it too. When one of these men was killed, the loss was profound and deeply personal. It was like losing a part of yourself. And in the environment of the trenches, these losses came with a brutal, numbing regularity. Let's explore the concept of no man's land at night. During the day, it was a deathly quiet, empty space. But at night, it came alive. This was when the real work of the war was done. Raiding parties from both sides would sneak out under the cover of darkness. Their missions were terrifying: to capture a prisoner for intelligence, to map the enemy's wire defenses, or to launch a surprise attack on an enemy listening post. These were silent, brutal affairs fought with knives, clubs, and grenades. Patrols would also go out to repair their own wire or to listen for enemy activity. Two patrols might stumble upon each other in the dark, leading to a frantic, confused fight for survival. The darkness of no man's land was filled with the ghosts of the unburied dead and the constant, gut-wrenching fear of a sudden, violent encounter. Consider the simple act of trying to stay warm. The winters on the Western Front were brutally cold. Temperatures would plummet far below freezing, and a biting wind would whip across the flat, open landscape. The trenches offered little protection. You were issued a standard uniform and a single greatcoat, which was quickly soaked through and caked in frozen mud. Your greatest enemy was the dampness, which seeped into your bones and made the cold feel 10 times worse. Men would huddle together for warmth in their dugouts. Small, smoky fires made from scavenged wood were a luxury, but they also risked attracting the attention of enemy snipers or artillery. Frostbite was common, claiming fingers, toes, and noses. The cold was a relentless, invisible enemy that drained your strength and your will to live, day after miserable day. Let's examine the role of new technology beyond gas. The tank made its debut in this war. Imagine you're a German soldier in a trench in 1916. You've endured the shelling, you're ready for the infantry attack you know is coming. But then, you see it. A monstrous, gray, metal beast, crawling slowly out of the morning mist. It moves with a clanking, grinding roar, impervious to your rifle and machine gun fire. It crosses your trench, its huge tracks churning the earth, and begins firing its cannons directly into your positions. The psychological shock was immense. These early tanks were mechanically unreliable, slow, and hot, but they represented a terrifying new paradigm of warfare. They were a symbol of the industrial might that was now directed at the complete annihilation of the individual soldier. Airplanes were also new to warfare. In the early days, they were used primarily for reconnaissance. Pilots would fly over the enemy lines, taking photographs and mapping trench systems. But soon, they became weapons themselves. Pilots started by throwing grenades or dropping small bombs by hand over the side of their cockpits. Then came the aerial dogfights. The image of the ace pilot as a modern-day knight is part of the romantic lie. For the man in the trench, the airplane was another source of terror from above. The drone of an enemy plane overhead meant that your position was being watched, that artillery was likely being directed at you. And as the war progressed, planes became capable of strafing runs, flying low over the trenches and firing their machine guns directly at the exposed soldiers below. There was truly no safe place. Let's consider the idea of a bloody wound more closely. It was the soldier's ultimate fantasy, the dream of an injury that was just right, serious enough to be sent home, but not serious enough to kill or permanently maim you. A clean shot through the arm or the leg was the golden ticket. This led to a grim reality: self-inflicted wounds. A soldier, driven to the absolute brink of his sanity by the unrelenting horror, might take his own rifle and shoot himself through the foot. It was a desperate gamble. If the wound was discovered to be self-inflicted, and the angle of the shot often gave it away, the punishment was severe. It was considered a desertion of duty in the face of the enemy, and the penalty was to be court-martialed and executed by a firing squad of your own comrades. It was a measure of the desperation that men were willing to risk certain death for the slim chance of escaping the front. The role of the chaplain, or padre, was a strange and complex one. These men of God were there to provide spiritual comfort in a place that seemed utterly godless. They would hold services in shelled-out barns just behind the lines, offering a few moments of peace and reflection amidst the chaos. Their most difficult and important job was burying the dead. They would gather the remains, often just fragments of a man, and perform a hasty burial service in a makeshift cemetery. They wrote countless letters to grieving families back home, trying to find words to comfort them without revealing the true, hideous nature of their son's death. The padres witnessed the very worst of the war, and many suffered their own crises of faith, struggling to reconcile the existence of a benevolent God with the industrial-scale slaughter they saw every single day. Let's talk about leave. If you were exceptionally lucky, you might be granted a few days of leave after many months at the front. You would travel back to a major city like Paris or London. The transition was jarring and surreal. One day you are living in a muddy ditch, surrounded by death and decay. The next, you are walking down a clean street, seeing people in fashionable clothes, laughing, dining in restaurants, and living in a world of blissful ignorance. The contrast was deeply unsettling. The everyday concerns of civilians, the weather, the price of food, seemed trivial and absurd compared to the life-and-death reality you had just left. You felt disconnected, like a ghost visiting a foreign world, and always, in the back of your mind, was the knowledge that in a few short days, you had to go back. This made true relaxation impossible. The return journey to the front was often worse than the first time. The first time, you were naive, filled with a sense of adventure. Now you knew exactly what you were going back to. You knew the mud, the rats, the shelling, the sheer terror. Every step of the journey, the train, the boat, the march, was a step back towards your own potential grave. The dread was a physical weight in your stomach. You would see the new replacements on their way to the front for the first time, their faces fresh and eager, and you would see yourself from months ago. You would feel a profound sense of pity for them, because you knew what they were about to face, and you knew that many of them would not survive their first week. You were a veteran now, and that meant you were a carrier of a terrible, unspeakable knowledge. Let us consider the landscape of the Somme, or Passchendaele, after months of battle. It was no longer a part of the natural world, it was a dead planet. The ground was not soil, it was a churned-up mixture of earth, metal, and human remains. The trees were gone, reduced to blackened, splintered stumps. The very air was poisoned. The shell craters linked together to form a vast, interconnected network of muddy pools, and in this landscape, the dead were everywhere. They were not buried immediately. They lay where they fell in no man's land, sometimes for weeks or months. They became a part of the terrain, bloating in the sun, being picked apart by rats and slowly sinking into the mud. Soldiers had to live and fight in this open-air cemetery, a constant, grim reminder of their own mortality. This was the world you inhabited. The relationship with your rifle was intimate. It was your only real tool and your constant companion. You were responsible for keeping it clean, a monumental task in the muddy, wet conditions of the trenches. You would spend hours meticulously cleaning the barrel and the bolt action, because a jammed rifle in the middle of an attack was a death sentence. You gave it a name. You slept with it. It became an extension of your own body. It was a simple, mechanical object, but it represented your only means of defense, your only way to exert some small measure of control over your own fate in a world where you were otherwise powerless. This simple piece of wood and steel was the one thing you could rely on when everything else had fallen apart. Let's look at the sheer weight you had to carry. Your equipment, or kit, was a heavy, cumbersome burden. You had your rifle and bayonet, 100 rounds of ammunition, a steel helmet, a gas mask, a shovel or pickaxe, a water bottle, your rations, a greatcoat, and a ground sheet. All of this was strapped to your body with a complex system of webbing. It could easily weigh over 60 pounds. Now imagine trying to move with that weight through thick, knee-deep mud, or trying to scramble out of a trench and run across broken ground while under fire. The weight was exhausting, slowing you down and making you an easier target. Many a man drowned in a flooded shell hole simply because he was too weighed down by his own equipment to climb out. The language of the trenches was its own dialect, a dark, cynical slang that helped men cope with the horror. A heavy shelling was a strafe, or a hate. The enemy was Fritz or Jerry. Your friends were your chums. A fatal wound was a packet. Being killed was copping it, or going west. This slang was a form of emotional armor. By giving the horror a casual, almost humorous name, it made it slightly more manageable. It was a way of creating a shared culture of survival, a secret language that only those who had experienced the front could truly understand. It was a way of saying, this is insane, but we are all in this together, so let's at least have a private laugh about it. Let's think about the act of standing guard at night. This was called sentry duty. You would stand on the fire step, peering over the parapet into the blackness of no man's land for 2 hours at a time. It was a job that required intense focus. You were listening for any sound of an enemy patrol or a raiding party. Your eyes would play tricks on you in the dark. A shattered tree stump would look like a man crawling towards you. The wind rustling through the barbed wire would sound like someone cutting it. The tension was immense, but it was also incredibly lonely. It was just you, the darkness, and the constant, terrifying thought that the fate of your entire section of the trench rested on your ability to stay awake and stay alert. Many men fell asleep on duty, and the punishment for that was death. The moment the war ended was as strange as the war itself. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent. After 4 years of continuous, deafening noise, the sudden, absolute silence was shocking. It was a physical presence. Men stood in their trenches, looking at each other in disbelief. There was no great cheering at first, just a stunned, quiet realization that it was over. The killing had stopped. Slowly, cautiously, soldiers began to climb out of their trenches, not to attack, but to simply stand in the open, in the daylight, without fear of being shot. They looked across at the enemy lines and saw other men doing the same thing. The war had ended, but the world it had created, the scars on the land and on the minds of the men who fought in it, would remain forever. Let's reflect on the immense scale of the loss. Over the course of the war, the British Empire alone suffered nearly 1 million combat deaths. France lost over 1.3 million. Germany lost over 2 million. These are not just numbers. Each one represents a unique human life. A man with a family, with dreams, with a future that was stolen from him. Entire generations of young men were wiped out. In Britain, these men became known as the Lost Generation. Their absence was felt in every town and every village, where memorials were erected, listing the names of the local dead. The war left a gaping hole in the fabric of society, a wound that would take decades to heal, and in some ways, never would. This was the ultimate cost of the glorious adventure. What happened to you, the survivor? You returned home, but you were not the same person who had left. You were older than your years, haunted by things you could never unsee. You might have physical scars, a missing limb, or lungs damaged by gas, but the invisible scars were often the deepest. You might struggle with shell shock, now known as PTSD. You might have trouble sleeping, be prone to fits of anger or depression, or feel a profound sense of detachment from the world around you. You were expected to pick up your old life, to go back to your job or your family, and to simply forget. But you could not forget. The trenches had become a part of you, a dark shadow that would follow you for the rest of your days. The popular memory of the war quickly became sanitized. The poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote about the true horror, but the mainstream narrative focused on heroism, sacrifice, and the glorious dead. The most brutal realities, the filth, the futility, the sheer mind-numbing terror, were quietly forgotten, smoothed over by a public that did not want to confront the ugly truth of what it had asked its young men to do. The lie that you had seen through, the lie of the noble heroic war, was rebuilt and reinforced, and this, perhaps, was the final tragic irony. After surviving a war that was built on a lie, you came home to find that the lie was more powerful than the truth you had lived. So when you see that old, romanticized image of the Great War soldier, remember what lies beneath it. Remember the reality. Remember the mud that tried to swallow him whole. Remember the rats that were his constant companions. Remember the lice that tormented him. Remember the monotonous food, the poisoned water, and the constant deafening noise. Remember the sheer random chance that determined whether he lived or died. The question was never about how bravely you would fight. The real question was, and always is, how much of your humanity you could hold on to while the world tried to grind it out of you. That is the true story of the soldier of World War I. Not a story of glory, but a quiet, profound, and heartbreaking story of human endurance. Let's examine the role of the humble sandbag. It was the fundamental building block of your world. The entire trench system, stretching for hundreds of miles, was lined with millions upon millions of them. Filling sandbags was one of the most common and hated chores. It was backbreaking, monotonous work. You would fill them with mud and clay, and the wet, heavy bags would scrape your hands raw. They were constantly in need of repair. Shrapnel from artillery shells would shred them, and the constant dampness would cause them to rot and burst. Your life depended on these simple bags of earth. They were the only thing separating you from a sniper's bullet or a shell fragment. You lived your life behind a wall of rotting burlap, a fragile barrier against a storm of steel. The latrine system, or lack thereof, was another source of daily misery and danger. In a well-established trench, there might be a designated latrine trench, a short sap dug away from the main line, but these were often in exposed positions and were prime targets for enemy snipers. Many soldiers were killed while trying to relieve themselves. In more primitive or forward positions, there was no system at all. Soldiers would use an empty tin can in a small recess in the trench wall, and then toss the contents over the parapet, usually at night. The entire area became contaminated with human waste, contributing to the ever-present stench and the rampant spread of disease. It was a constant, humiliating reminder of how the war stripped away every shred of human dignity. Let's consider the concept of wastage. This was the official military term for the daily, predictable loss of men, The generals and staff officers, sitting in comfortable chateaus miles behind the lines, would look at their maps and charts and calculate the expected number of casualties for any given period. They knew that a certain number of men would be killed or wounded each day by snipers, shelling, and disease. You, the soldier, were a part of that calculation. Your life was a number on a ledger, a resource to be expended. This cold, detached, bureaucratic approach to human life was one of the defining horrors of the war. It underscored the fact that you were not seen as an individual, but as a tiny, replaceable cog in a vast military machine. The relationship between junior officers and their men was unique. These young lieutenants, often fresh from public schools and with little life experience, were thrust into positions of immense responsibility. They were expected to lead men, some of whom were twice their age, in the most terrifying situations imaginable. Their job was to be the first one out of the trench, to lead the charge, and to set an example of courage. As a result, their life expectancy was shockingly low. The men often felt a mixture of respect and pity for them. They admired their bravery, but they knew that these young, well-spoken boys were often walking dead men. The bond formed between a good officer and his platoon was incredibly strong, but it was a bond forged in the certainty of impending loss. Let's talk about the sound of a wounded man in no man's land. After an attack failed, the area between the trenches would be filled with the dead and the dying. As night fell, a terrible sound would rise from the darkness, the cries of the wounded. Men would cry out for help, for water, for their mothers. These sounds would go on for hours, sometimes for days. You would lie in your trench, listening to these desperate, agonizing pleas from men you knew, from your friends, and there was nothing you could do. To go out and help them would be suicide. So you had to lie there and listen to them die, a slow, agonizing death just a few yards away. This experience was one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of trench warfare, a memory that would haunt survivors forever. The use of trench clubs and other primitive weapons speaks volumes about the nature of combat. When a raid or an attack reached the enemy trench, the fighting was too close and chaotic for rifles. It devolved into a medieval brawl. Soldiers would fashion their own brutal weapons. The trench club was a common example, a short wooden club, often studded with nails, hobnails, or any other sharp piece of metal. Sharpened shovels, knives, and brass knuckles were also used. This was the grim paradox of the Great War. It was the first truly modern, industrial war, defined by machine guns and artillery. But at its heart, the final, decisive moments were often fought with the most primitive and brutal weapons imaginable, man against man in a muddy ditch. Let's explore the black market that existed just behind the lines. In the rear areas and rest camps, a thriving economy of trade and barter emerged. A soldier might trade his rum ration for a few cigarettes. A fresh loaf of bread, liberated from a supply depot, could be traded for a German helmet or some other souvenir. These small transactions were a way of reclaiming some agency in a world where you had none. They were a small act of defiance against the rigid, impersonal military system. It was a way to get a small comfort, a brief taste of something other than bully beef, and a reminder of a normal world where goods and services were exchanged, not just orders given and received. The sky itself was a battlefield. Beyond the famous dogfights, reconnaissance planes played a crucial, and for the soldier, a terrifying role. The appearance of a slow-moving enemy spotter plane was a cause for immediate alarm. It meant the enemy was mapping your trench layout, or, even worse, directing artillery fire. The plane would circle lazily overhead, seeming to hang in the air, while you felt completely exposed below. You would hear the whistle of the shells, and you knew that an unseen observer high above was watching the explosions and radioing corrections to the gunners miles away, guiding the shells ever closer to your position. It created a feeling of profound helplessness, of being a bug under a magnifying glass. Let's consider the specific terror of a wiring party. At night, Groups of men had to crawl out into no man's land to repair the barbed wire defenses or to string new ones. This was one of the most dangerous jobs on the front. You would be working in complete darkness, trying to be as quiet as possible, your hands being torn to shreds by the barbs. The constant fear was that the enemy was doing the same thing just yards away. The greatest danger was the flare. The enemy would periodically fire a flare into the sky, which would burst and illuminate the entire landscape in a brilliant, ghastly white light for a few seconds. If you were caught in the open by a flare, you had to freeze instantly. Any movement would draw a hail of machine gun fire. You would lie there, motionless, your heart pounding, praying for the darkness to return. The role of rumors was central to life in the trenches. In the absence of reliable information, rumors, known as latrine-ograms, would spread like wildfire. A big attack was coming. Your division was about to be relieved. The enemy was on the verge of collapse. The war would be over in a month. Most of these rumors were baseless, born of a mixture of hope and fear. But they were a vital coping mechanism. They provided a flicker of hope in a hopeless situation. Believing, even for a few hours, that relief was coming could be enough to get you through another day. It was a form of mental self-preservation, a way to create a narrative of hope when the reality was only despair. Let's talk about the moment you first kill a man. It might happen during a raid, or in the chaos of an attack. It might be with a bayonet, a grenade, or a shot from your rifle. It is not like it is in the movies. There is no sense of victory or glory. There is only a sickening, shocking finality. You see the life leave another human being's eyes because of something you have done. The experience is deeply traumatic. It is a line that, once crossed, you can never uncross. It changes you fundamentally. Many soldiers were haunted not by the men who tried to kill them, but by the men they themselves had killed. It was another heavy stone added to the psychological burden that every soldier had to carry. The relationship with animals in the trenches was complex. Beyond the reviled rats, other animals played a role. Mules were used to carry supplies to the front, and their casualty rates were as high as the men's. Dogs were used as messengers and sentries, but the most common companions were the lice, which soldiers morbidly referred to as their little pets. The act of chatting, or killing lice with a candle, was a social ritual. It was a small battle you could actually win. For a few brief moments, you could fight back against the filth and misery of your existence and achieve a small, satisfying victory. It was a pathetic but necessary act of asserting control in a world designed to strip you of it. Let us reflect on the aftermath of a major battle, like the Somme. The attack is over. The objectives may or may not have been taken. Your unit, or what's left of it, is pulled back from the line. You take a roll call. You call out the names of your friends, your comrades, the men you shared everything with. And name after name is met with silence. The sheer scale of the absence is staggering. The platoon that went into battle with 40 men might come out with 10. The survivors are left in a state of shock and grief, hollowed out by the loss. There is no victory parade, only the quiet, grim task of trying to process the fact that almost everyone you knew is gone. The concept of blame was a constant undercurrent. The ordinary soldier, the Tommy, felt a deep and abiding resentment for the staff officers in the rear. They saw the generals as out-of-touch old men, moving pins on a map, ordering attacks that resulted in the slaughter of thousands, all from the comfort of a safe chateau. This was the lions led by donkeys theory. While the historical reality is more complex, this was the perception on the ground. It was a feeling that your life was being thrown away for nothing, for the strategic blunders of men who would never have to face the consequences of their decisions. This cynicism was a key part of the soldier's worldview. The sound of singing was a strange and poignant feature of the war. Men would sing on the march to the front, their voices full of patriotic fervor. They would sing in the estaminets, the small bars in the rear areas, their songs becoming more mournful and cynical. They would even sing quietly in the trenches, the familiar melodies, a small comfort against the darkness and the fear. The songs told a story of the war, from the optimistic tunes of 1914 to the dark satirical parodies of the later years. Singing was a way to build morale, to pass the time, and to express a shared experience that was otherwise beyond words. It was a fragile human sound in a landscape dominated by the noise of machines. Let's consider the final moment of your survival, the journey home. The war is over. You are on a boat crossing the English Channel. You see the white cliffs of Dover. It is a moment you have dreamed of for years. But the feeling is not one of pure joy. It is a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a deep, profound sadness for all that was lost, and for all the men who would never make this journey. You have survived, but you are not the same man. You carry the ghosts of the trenches with you. You have been to a different planet, and now you must learn how to live again on this one. Your war is over, but the battle within you has just begun. Let us examine the physical transformation of your body. Beyond wounds or trench foot, the daily grind of the front line reshaped you. You were perpetually thin from the inadequate diet and constant physical exertion. Your skin was coarse, weathered by the wind and the sun, and often pocked with infected sores from insect bites and scratches. There was a permanent layer of grime under your fingernails and in the pores of your skin that no amount of washing could remove. Your posture changed. You developed a permanent crouch from constantly stooping in the trenches, and your face acquired the 1,000-yard stare, your eyes becoming hollow and distant, a physical manifestation of the mental and emotional exhaustion that had become your constant state. Let's talk about sleep deprivation. It was a form of torture inflicted by the routine of war. On the front line, you were lucky to get an hour or two of uninterrupted sleep at a time. Sentry duty, work parties, and the constant threat of attack meant that your sleep was always fragmented. The shelling was the biggest culprit. A nearby explosion would jolt you awake, your heart pounding, your body flooded with adrenaline. Even when the guns were quiet, the fear kept you from truly resting. This chronic lack of sleep had a severe impact on your physical and mental health. It slowed your reaction times, impaired your judgment, and made you more susceptible to both illness and the psychological ravages of shell shock. The significance of a letter from home cannot be overstated. It was a lifeline, a tangible link to a world of sanity and love that seemed a universe away. The mail call was the most anticipated event of the day. A letter meant that someone was thinking of you, that you were not forgotten. It was a piece of the reality you were fighting to return to. You would read the letters over and over again, the paper becoming soft and worn, until you knew every word by heart. But letters could also bring pain. A Dear John letter, breaking off a relationship, could be devastating. And the worst was the letter informing you of a death in the family, a grief you had to process alone in the midst of the chaos. Let's look at the souvenirs soldiers collected. This was a common practice, a way of trying to make sense of the experience, or to have a tangible trophy of your survival. A popular souvenir was the German helmet, the Pickelhaube, with its distinctive spike. Other items included uniform buttons, belt buckles with Gott mit uns, God with us on them, or shell fragments. This collecting was a strange and morbid hobby, a way of domesticating the horror. By turning an instrument of war into a personal possession, you exerted a small amount of power over it. These objects would be sent home as proof that you had been there, that you had faced the enemy and lived to tell the tale. The relationship with the French and Belgian civilians was often strained. In the rear areas, you would be billeted in their barns or houses. To you, they were a part of the landscape of the war. But to them, you were a part of a foreign army that had turned their home into a battlefield. They had lost their farms, their livelihoods, and their family members. While there were many instances of kindness and friendship, there was also resentment and exploitation. The local shopkeepers and bar owners often charged exorbitant prices, knowing the soldiers had money to spend and few other options. You were both victims of the war, but you were trapped in a relationship of mutual dependency and suspicion. Let's consider the absurdity of military discipline in the face of annihilation. Even in the mud and chaos of the front line, the army tried to enforce its rigid rules. You could be put on a charge for having a dirty rifle, for not saluting an officer correctly, or for having a button undone on your tunic. These minor infractions seemed utterly insane when you were surrounded by death and destruction. It was an attempt by the high command to maintain order and control in a situation that was fundamentally chaotic. To the soldier, it was just another source of misery, another way the impersonal machine of the army exerted its power over your individual life, worrying about the shine on your boots while you were trying not to be blown to pieces. The role of humor was a crucial survival tool. It was a dark, cynical, gallows humor that would be shocking to an outsider, but it was essential for maintaining sanity. Soldiers would make jokes about the terrible food, the rats, the shelling, and the near certainty of death. It was a way of looking the horror directly in the face and laughing at it. Satirical newspapers, written and drawn by the soldiers themselves, like the famous Wipers Times, were filled with blackly comic poems, cartoons, and mock advertisements that poked fun at the absurdity of their situation. This humor was not a sign of callousness, it was a sign of resilience. It was a refusal to be completely broken by the despair of the trenches. Let's think about the seasons. Each one brought a different kind of misery. The winter brought the brutal cold, the frozen mud, and the risk of frostbite. Spring brought the thaw, turning the trenches into rivers of thick, clinging mud, and it also brought the spring offensive, the time when major attacks were most likely. The summer brought sweltering heat, a plague of flies that swarmed on the rotting refuse and the dead, and the stench of the battlefield became almost unbearable. The autumn brought the endless, depressing rain that soaked everything and heralded the coming of another winter. There was no good season on the Western Front. Each one was simply a different flavor of suffering. The moment you realize you are a veteran is a somber one. It happens when you are in a rest area and a new batch of replacements arrives. You see their clean uniforms, their eager, nervous faces, and their ignorance of what is to come. You hear them talking about glory and adventure, the same things you talked about months ago. And you realize how much you have changed. You are no longer one of them. You are one of the survivors. You are cynical, weary, and old before your time. You don't bother to correct them or warn them. You know that words are useless. The trench will teach them soon enough. You just feel a quiet, profound sadness for them. Let's imagine the sensory memory you would carry for the rest of your life. It would not just be the sights. It would be the smell. That unique foul combination of mud, stagnant water, cordite, gas, rotting sandbags, latrines, and death. It would be the sounds, the unending roar of the guns, the shriek of shells, the crack of rifles, the screams of the wounded. It would be the taste, the greasy bully beef, the metallic tang of chlorinated water, the constant grit of mud in your mouth. And it would be the feeling, the perpetual dampness, the chafing of your coarse uniform, the maddening itch of lice, and the cold, gnawing fear in the pit of your stomach. The war would live on inside you, a ghost in your senses. Let's consider the impact on your faith. Before the war, you might have been a religious man. You might have believed in a just and merciful God. But after months in the trenches, it became very difficult to maintain that faith. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering, such senseless slaughter? You saw prayers go unanswered. You saw good, decent men die hideous deaths, while cruel and selfish men survived. For many, the war shattered their religious beliefs, replacing them with a cold, hard atheism or a cynical agnosticism. The trenches were a place where it seemed that God was absent, or perhaps had never existed at all. The bloody wound fantasy had a dark twin, the fear of being maimed. While a clean wound that would send you home was the dream, The reality was often far more horrific. The weapons of this war were designed to shatter and tear. Soldiers lived in constant fear of losing a limb, of being blinded, or of suffering a facial injury that would leave them disfigured for life. They saw the results every day: men with missing arms and legs, men with horrific facial wounds that made them unrecognizable. The fear was not just of death, but of surviving in a broken, ruined body, of having to live with the physical consequences of the war for the next 50 years. Let's talk about the specific job of a runner. In an age before reliable field radios, communication between different command posts and the front line was done by runners. This was one of the most dangerous jobs in the Army. A runner had to carry messages through active battlefields, dodging bullets and shells. They had to cross open ground that was being swept by machine gun fire and zeroed in by artillery. The chances of survival for a runner during a major attack were incredibly slim. They were a vital link in the chain of command, but they were also utterly expendable. It was a job that required immense bravery and an incredible amount of luck. Let's reflect on the idea of home. It became a mythical place, a paradise that you clung to in your mind. You would daydream about the simplest things: sleeping in a real bed with clean sheets, eating a home-cooked meal, taking a hot bath, or just walking down a peaceful street without fear. These simple, everyday things became the symbols of everything you were fighting for. Home was not an abstract concept like king and country. It was the warm, safe, comfortable reality you desperately wanted to return to. This idealized image of home was what kept many men going. It was the light at the end of a very long, very dark, and very bloody tunnel. The battlefield itself had a strange, terrible beauty. A flare bursting in the night sky could be beautiful, showering the landscape in a cascade of brilliant light. A sunrise over the misty, shattered landscape could be breathtaking, the soft light painting the clouds in shades of pink and orange. These moments of aesthetic beauty, in the midst of absolute horror, were deeply unsettling. They were a reminder of a natural world that still existed, a world that was indifferent to the human madness playing out below. It was a beauty that was tainted by death, a beautiful frame around a hideous picture. Let us examine the role of the machine gun. It was, more than any other weapon, the symbol of the war's futility. A single, well-placed machine gun, operated by a few men, could hold off an entire battalion of attacking soldiers. It could fire hundreds of rounds a minute, creating an impenetrable wall of lead. The tactic of sending waves of infantrymen against entrenched machine guns was suicidal, yet it was repeated over and over again. The machine gun turned the battlefield into a machine for killing. It made individual bravery almost irrelevant. It didn't matter how courageous you were. You were a fragile human body walking into a stream of high-velocity steel. Let's look at the creeping barrage. This was a tactic developed later in the war to try to break the stalemate of the trenches. The idea was that your own artillery would fire a continuous barrage that moved forward at a slow, walking pace, just ahead of your attacking infantry. You were supposed to stay as close as possible to this wall of exploding shells. The goal was to keep the enemy defenders in their dugouts until you were right on top of them. But it was incredibly dangerous. If the barrage moved too fast, you were left in the open. If it moved too slow, or if a shell fell short, you would be killed by your own guns. It was like walking on a tightrope, with death on all sides. The psychological effect of living in a hole in the ground was profound. Human beings are not meant to live like this. You were living a subterranean existence, like a mole or an earthworm. Your view of the world was limited to a narrow strip of sky above and the muddy walls of the trench around you. This constant confinement, this lack of a horizon, had a deeply depressing effect. It contributed to the feeling of being trapped, of being buried before you were even dead. The rare moments when you could go to the rear and see an open field or a hill were a profound relief, a reminder that the world was bigger than your muddy linear prison. Let's consider the final toll of your survival. You made it home. But the war took its payment. It took your friends, it took your youth, it took your innocence. It may have taken a limb or the health of your lungs. It took your ability to sleep peacefully. It took your faith in the goodness of humanity and the wisdom of leaders. You survived the Great War, but you learned a terrible truth, that the opposite of war is not peace. The opposite of war is civilization. And you had seen firsthand just how fragile that civilization truly is, and how easily it can be washed away by a tide of mud and blood. So when we ask how long would you survive, the answer is more complex than a number of weeks or months. You might have survived the shelling and the bullets, only to be taken by the flu pandemic that swept the world in 1918. You might have survived the war, only to succumb to the effects of gas poisoning years later. You might have survived physically, only to be a lifelong casualty of shell shock. The war did not end in 1918 for the men who fought it. It was a sentence, and for the lucky ones, it was a life sentence. The real measure of survival was not whether you came home, but how much of the man you were before the war came home with you. Let's delve deeper into the soundscape beyond the explosions. There was the sound of the wire, in the wind. The thousands of strands of barbed wire in no man's land would vibrate and hum, creating a mournful, eerie music. It was a constant, low-level sound that became a part of the background noise of the trenches. At night, a stray bit of debris, perhaps a tin can, caught on the wire would rattle in the wind, sounding for all the world like an enemy patrol cutting their way through. This sound could send a jolt of pure adrenaline through a nervous sentry, his imagination turning a simple, natural noise into an immediate threat. The wire was not just a physical barrier, it was an instrument in the orchestra of fear. Consider the mundane but critical task of trench maintenance. The trenches were not static structures. They were in a constant state of decay. The rain would erode the walls, causing them to collapse. Shell fire would blow huge sections apart. Your daily life involved an endless cycle of shoring up the walls with A-frames and wooden revetments, laying down duckboards, wooden slats, to create a walkable path over the mud, and digging drainage sumps to try and control the water. It was the work of a manual laborer, but performed under the constant threat of death. You were simultaneously a soldier and a construction worker, fighting a two-front war against both the enemy and the very earth you were standing on, which seemed determined to reclaim the trench and bury you in it. Let's talk about the food from the other side. During a successful raid on an enemy trench, one of the most prized loots was not intelligence or weapons, but food. German black bread, a dense, dark rye, was considered a delicacy compared to the rock-hard British hardtack. Their sausages and tinned meats were also highly sought after. Finding these items was a rare treat, a small victory that had nothing to do with the strategic goals of the war. It was a simple human moment of enjoying a different taste, a brief escape from the monotony of your own rations. It also served as another reminder that the enemy was a man who enjoyed a good piece of sausage just as much as you did. The concept of a cushy posting was the soldier's dream. This referred to a job or a sector of the front that was known to be quiet and relatively safe. It might be a section of the line held by a less aggressive enemy unit, or a job in the rear echelons, like a cook, a clerk, or a driver. Soldiers would talk about these postings with a kind of reverence. Getting a cushy job was like winning the lottery. It meant you were out of the daily meat grinder of the front line. However, there was often a sense of guilt associated with it. While you were safe, you knew that your friends were still in the trenches, facing the daily horror. The relief of your own safety was always tinged with the guilt of the survivor. Let's examine the role of maps. To the generals in the rear, the battlefield was a map, a clean, abstract grid of lines and symbols. Trenches were neat red and blue lines. Units were small rectangles. But to you, the soldier, this abstraction was a cruel joke. The map bore no resemblance to the chaotic three-dimensional hell you inhabited. A small line on a map was a real-world ditch filled with mud, rats, and dead bodies. A small, square-marked machine gun post was a very real source of terror that could kill you and all your friends. The disconnect between the clean, orderly map and the filthy, chaotic reality was a perfect symbol of the gulf between the men who planned the war and the men who had to fight it. Let's talk about the morning hate. This was a grimly predictable ritual on many parts of the front. At dawn, just as the sun was rising, both sides would often unleash a short, intense burst of machine gun, rifle, and artillery fire. It was a way of saying good morning to the enemy, of reminding them that you were still there and still ready to kill them. It was also the most dangerous time for sentries who were trying to peer through the morning mist. You learned to keep your head down at dawn and dusk. This ritual was a perfect example of the war's ingrained, routine-driven nature. Even the killing had a schedule. Consider the impact of the 1918 influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu. It swept across the globe and hit the armies on the Western Front with devastating force. After 4 years of being weakened by stress, poor nutrition, and unsanitary conditions, the soldiers were incredibly vulnerable. The flu killed more people worldwide than the war itself. It was a cruel irony that you could survive years of bullets and shells, only to be killed by a virus. Entire platoons were rendered combat ineffective by the sickness. For a soldier who had endured so much, dying from a fever in a hospital bed seemed a particularly pointless and tragic end. It was the final, indiscriminate killer in a war defined by them. Let's look at the phenomenon of trench art. In the long hours of boredom, soldiers would create objects from the debris of war. They would carve intricate designs into shell casings, turning them into vases. They would make rings out of the aluminum from fuses. They would build model airplanes out of scrap metal. This was more than just a hobby. It was a deeply human act of creation in the midst of destruction. It was a way to impose order and beauty on the ugly, chaotic materials of the battlefield. It was an assertion of individuality and skill in a world that treated you as an anonymous, expendable number. These objects are a poignant legacy of the men who made them. The fear of being taken prisoner was complex. On one hand, it meant you were out of the fighting, that you had survived. But it came with its own set of terrors. You feared being mistreated or executed by your captors. You faced the shame of surrender, which was deeply ingrained as a disgrace. And you faced the unknown. Prisoner of war camps were often harsh, with meager rations and poor conditions. You would sit out the rest of the war behind barbed wire, filled with uncertainty about your fate and the guilt of no longer being with your comrades. For many, it was a preferable alternative to certain death, but it was not an easy way out. Let's consider the specific role of the bayonet. It was a symbol of the war, featured heavily in training and propaganda. You were taught how to use it in a series of brutal, efficient moves. But in reality, it was used less often than one might think. Most casualties were caused by artillery and machine guns. However, when it was used, in the close-quarters horror of a trench raid, it was a terrifying weapon. The bayonet charge was more of a psychological tool than a practical one. The sight of a line of men charging with cold steel was intended to break the enemy's nerve. But the psychological toll on the man wielding the bayonet was also immense. It represented the most personal, primal, and brutal form of killing. Let's explore the unofficial communication between the lines. Beyond the famous Christmas truce, soldiers would find ways to signal to each other. They might shout insults or jokes across no man's land. They might hold up signs with messages on them. In some sectors, they would use a ration truce, where they would tacitly agree not to fire on the parties bringing food up to the line. These small acts were a rebellion against the dehumanizing logic of the war. They were a recognition that the man on the other side was not a monster, but a person in the same miserable situation. It was a fragile, secret truce between the men who had to do the actual fighting and dying. The sky was not just a place of danger. It was also a place of wonder. The new technology of flight was on full display. Soldiers would stop and watch the aerial dogfights between the aces of both sides. These duels, high above the trenches, were seen as a cleaner, more chivalrous form of combat, a throwback to the days of knights in single combat. It was a form of entertainment, a distraction from the squalor below. The men would cheer for their own pilots, as if watching a sporting match. It was a strange disconnect, watching these graceful, deadly dances in the sky, while you were trapped in the mud and the blood of the trenches. Let's talk about the smell of death. It was a constant, unavoidable part of the sensory landscape. The dead lay in no man's land for weeks, and the smell of their decomposition would drift over the trenches, especially in the summer heat. It was a sweet, cloying, sickly smell that would get into your clothes and the back of your throat. But it wasn't just the enemy dead. It was your own comrades, buried in shallow graves behind the lines, or the fragments of bodies that were unearthed by shell fire. You became accustomed to it, but you never truly got used to it. It was the permanent smell of the front line, the perfume of industrial-scale death. Let's consider the role of poetry. The Great War produced a generation of powerful poets who forever changed our understanding of conflict. Men like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Isaac Rosenberg were not writing patriotic jingles about glory. They were soldiers, and they used their art to document the brutal, unvarnished truth of the trenches. They wrote about the gas attacks, the shell-shocked soldiers, the corpses in the mud. Their poetry was a raw, angry, and deeply compassionate cry against the futility and horror of the war. It was a form of testimony, ensuring that the true experience of the soldier would not be forgotten or sanitized by the official narrative. The concept of a million-dollar wound or a blighty was so pervasive that it became a dark fantasy. But what if you were wounded and couldn't be evacuated? You might be hit during an attack, falling into a shell crater in no man's land. The battle moves on and you are left behind. You are trapped between the two lines, unable to move due to your injuries. Your only hope is that a stretcher-bearer party will find you after dark. You lie there, in pain, listening to the bullets zipping overhead, praying that you don't bleed out or get hit again. The hours of waiting, alone and helpless, in that desolate landscape, were a form of torture that could break even the strongest man. Let's talk about the specific terror of mining warfare. In some sectors, the war went underground. Specialist tunneling companies would dig long tunnels or saps under numberman's land, trying to get beneath the enemy's trenches. The goal was to plant a massive amount of explosives and detonate it, obliterating the enemy position. The work was claustrophobic, silent, and incredibly dangerous. The tunnelers would work in near darkness, listening for the faint sound of the enemy digging a countermine towards them. If the two tunnels met, a brutal underground battle would ensue. For the regular soldier in the trench above, there was the constant, terrifying thought that the ground beneath your feet could erupt at any moment without warning. The role of pay was another source of cynicism. A British private was paid about £1 a day. It was a pitiful amount for the work you were doing and the risks you were taking. You knew that the men working in the munitions factories back home were earning many times what you were. This disparity fueled a sense of resentment. It felt like your life was valued very cheaply by the country that was asking you to sacrifice it. The small amount of pay was often spent quickly in the rear areas on small comforts like beer, cigarettes, or a decent meal, a brief and expensive escape from the reality of the front. Let's consider the legacy of the landscape. Long after the war ended, the land on the Western Front remained scarred. Farmers plowing their fields would, and still do, unearth a grim iron harvest of unexploded shells, shrapnel, bullets, and barbed wire. They also find the bones of the thousands of soldiers who were never recovered and buried. The land itself became a permanent, living memorial to the conflict. The gentle slopes of the Somme are still pocked with the faint outlines of trenches and shell craters, and the soil is still filled with the physical remnants of the war, a testament to the sheer scale of the violence that was unleashed there. The moment of seeing a friend killed had a profound and lasting impact. It was not a cinematic, heroic death. It was sudden, brutal, and often grotesque. One moment, you are sharing a cigarette and a joke with your best friend, the man you have endured everything with. The next moment, he is gone, taken by a random shell or a sniper's bullet. There is no time to mourn properly. You have to push the grief down and keep functioning, because to stop is to die. But the image of his death, the sound he made, the look on his face, would be burned into your memory forever. You would carry these ghosts with you, a silent committee of the dead, for the rest of your life. So we return to our central question. Survival in World War I was not a single event. It was a process. It was the act of surviving 1,000 small deaths every day. You survived the cold. You survived the hunger. You survived the disease. You survived the boredom. You survived the fear. You survived the loss of your friends and the loss of your own innocence. The ultimate irony is that the qualities that made a good soldier, the courage to charge a machine gun, the willingness to follow orders without question, were often the very qualities that got you killed. The survivors were often the lucky ones, the cynical ones, the ones who learned to keep their heads down and navigate the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of attrition. Let's examine the role of the pack animal, specifically the mule. Horses were too temperamental for the shell-shocked environment of the front, but mules were stubborn, resilient, and sure-footed. They were the unsung heroes of the supply chain, hauling ammunition, food, and water up to the front lines through miles of muddy, treacherous tracks, often at night. They suffered terribly. They were shelled, shot, and succumbed to exhaustion and disease at an astonishing rate. Soldiers often formed deep bonds with these animals, seeing in them a reflection of their own stubborn endurance and suffering. The loss of a mule was not just a logistical problem. For many, it was the loss of a fellow, silent veteran. Consider the simple act of shaving. It was a small ritual of normalcy and discipline that the army tried to enforce. But how do you shave in a trench? You would use a small polished piece of metal as a mirror. Your water would be cold and likely dirty, drawn from a shell hole. Your razor would be dull. Yet, men would do it. The act of scraping away the stubble was an act of defiance against the filth that was trying to consume you. It was a way to feel human for a few minutes, to see a semblance of your old self in the reflection. It was a small but significant battle in the larger war to maintain your own identity and dignity. Let's talk about the specific fear of being buried alive. Artillery shells, especially the huge high-explosive ones from howitzers, could cause a trench or a dugout to collapse in an instant. You would be plunged into absolute darkness, your mouth and nose filled with dirt. The immense weight of the earth would press in on you, making it impossible to breathe. Panic would set in as you realized you were trapped. Your only hope was that your comrades saw what happened and could dig you out in time. But often, they were dead themselves, or the shelling was too intense to mount a rescue. The fear of this slow, suffocating death was one of the most primal and pervasive terrors of the trenches. The estaminet was a sanctuary. These were small, family-run cafes or bars in the villages just behind the lines. When your unit was rotated back for a rest, you would flock to them. Here, for a few hours, you could escape the war. You could sit in a real chair, drink cheap wine or beer, and try to forget. They were often crowded, noisy, and smoky, but they were a haven of warmth and fragile normalcy. The madame who ran the estaminet was a central figure, a maternal presence who would tolerate the soldiers' rough ways. These places were where the famous mournful songs of the trenches were sung and where bonds of friendship were cemented over a shared bottle. Let's explore the concept of battlefield salvage. After an attack, teams would be sent out to recover whatever they could from the battlefield. This meant rifles, ammunition, and equipment from the dead and wounded of both sides. It was a grim and dangerous job. but it also involved the personal effects of the dead. You might be tasked with going through the pockets of a dead comrade to find his paybook and personal letters to be sent home. This act of handling the intimate belongings of a man who was alive just hours before was a profoundly disturbing and saddening experience. It was a stark, administrative finality to a human life. The relationship with non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals, was the most important one in your military life. These were veteran soldiers who had risen from the ranks. They were not the remote upper-class officers. They were the men who taught you how to survive. They knew the tricks of the trade, how to stay dry, how to spot a sniper, when to keep your head down. A good sergeant was a father figure, a teacher, and a fierce protector of his men. He would stand between you and the foolish orders of a green lieutenant. He was the glue that held the platoon together. Your survival often depended directly on his experience and his leadership. Let's talk about the specific horror of shrapnel. A shrapnel shell was designed to burst in the air above the trenches, spraying a shower of small metal balls downwards. It was an anti-personnel weapon of terrifying effectiveness. You would hear the shell burst overhead with a sharp crack, and then a split second later the air would be filled with the sound of whizzing, screaming metal. You could only cower and hope that none of it found you. The wounds from shrapnel were nasty, ragged, and prone to infection. It was another example of the war's impersonal nature. It wasn't a sniper aiming at you. It was just a random rain of steel from the sky. Consider the role of sports and games. In the rare moments of genuine rest in the rear areas, the Army would organize sports to maintain morale and physical fitness. Boxing matches were popular, as were tug-of-war competitions. The most beloved was football, soccer. A game of football, played on a makeshift pitch with coats for goalposts, was a blessed escape. For 90 minutes, you could be a young man again, running and shouting, your mind focused on nothing but the ball. It was a powerful reminder of a normal life, a life before the war. These games were a vital psychological release, a brief holiday from the grim business of survival. The field postcard was a stark piece of communication. It was a pre-printed card with a series of phrases like, "I am quite well," "I have been admitted into hospital," "I am going on well," "I have received your letter." The soldier was only allowed to cross out the phrases that did not apply. There was no space for a personal message. It was an efficient but chillingly impersonal way to communicate. A card arriving at home with the phrase, "I have been admitted into hospital," left a family in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Was it a minor wound or a life-threatening one? The postcard was a symbol of how the Army system reduced the complex, emotional reality of your situation to a simple, bureaucratic checklist. Let's reflect on the moment you were issued your gas mask. It was a somber occasion. You were taught how to put it on quickly, how to check the seal. The mask itself, the small box respirator, was a claustrophobic thing. A rubberized fabric hood with fragile mica eyepieces that fogged up instantly, connected by a tube to a filter box you wore on your chest. The act of receiving it was a clear signal that the nature of warfare had changed. You were now facing an enemy that was not just a man with a gun, but a silent, invisible poison that could suffocate you. It was a tangible symbol of the new, terrifying scientific dimension of the war. Let's consider the specific job of being on a listening post. This involved crawling out into no man's land at night and occupying a small advanced position, sometimes just a shell crater, very close to the enemy lines. Your job was to listen for any signs of an impending attack or a raiding party. It was arguably the most nerve-wracking job on the front. You were isolated, in the dark, and acutely aware that you were only yards away from the enemy. Every rustle, every cough could be a sign of imminent, violent death. The hours spent on a listening post were some of the longest and most terrifying of a soldier's life. The black humor of the trenches often manifested in satirical names for places. A particularly dangerous section of trench might be nicknamed Windy Corner. A path that was constantly shelled might be called Death Valley. A ruined wood might be called Polygon Wood, because all that was left were the stumps. This naming was a way of taming the fear. By giving a terrifying place a mundane or even funny name, you stripped it of some of its power. It was a coping mechanism, a way of asserting a small amount of control over an environment that was fundamentally uncontrollable. It was the gallows humor of men who lived with death as their next-door neighbor. Let's talk about the sheer physical filth. You were constantly dirty. The mud was a given, but there was also the grease from your rifle, the soot from fires and explosions, and the general grime of living in a crowded, unsanitary hole in the ground. A bath was a rare and treasured luxury, something that might happen only once every few weeks, or even months, when you were rotated far to the rear. The feeling of submerging your body in hot water and scrubbing away the layers of filth was a moment of pure, transcendent bliss. It was a baptism, a temporary washing away of the physical and, for a moment, the psychological stains of the front line. The importance of the rum ration cannot be overstated. Before an attack, or on a particularly cold morning, you would be issued a small amount of rum. This SRD, service rum diluted, was a fiery, potent liquid that provided a moment of liquid courage. It warmed you from the inside out and briefly dulled the sharp edges of your fear. The sergeants who doled it out were popular figures. The rum ration was a treasured ritual, a small comfort that the Army provided. It was a tacit admission by the High Command that what they were asking you to do was so terrible that you needed to be drugged to do it. Let's consider the experience of a soldier from one of the colonies, like Australia, Canada, or India. These men had traveled halfway across the world to fight in a European war. They often felt a strong sense of their own distinct identity and were known for their fighting prowess and independence. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, Anzacs for example, forged their national identity in the fires of Gallipoli and the Western Front. But they also felt a sense of alienation, fighting so far from their homes for a mother country that some had never even seen. Their experience added another layer of complexity to the vast multinational tapestry of the war. The sound of a man with shell shock was a common and disturbing feature of the rear areas and hospitals. It was not just the thousand-yard stare. It was the uncontrollable shaking, the stammering, the sudden fits of screaming or crying. These men were the living embodiment of what the war did to the human mind. Seeing them was terrifying for other soldiers because you saw a potential version of your own future. You saw that it was possible to survive the war physically, but be utterly destroyed mentally. It was a stark reminder that some wounds were invisible, and that these invisible wounds might never heal. Let's talk about the friendship between an older veteran and a new replacement. The veteran, a man in his late 20s, would seem like an ancient sage to the 18-year-old newcomer. The veteran would take the new boy under his wing, teaching him the unwritten rules of survival: how to walk through the trench, where not to stand, how to clean his rifle. It was a paternal relationship, born of a sense of responsibility and a desire to see the boy live. When the newcomer was inevitably killed, the loss was particularly painful for the veteran. It was like losing a son, and it reinforced the futility and the endless, cruel cycle of the war. The sheer volume of correspondence was staggering. Millions of letters and parcels were sent to and from the front every week. The Army Postal Service was an incredibly efficient organization, a testament to the importance of mail for morale. A letter from home was a connection to reality, but writing a letter back was a difficult act of censorship. You couldn't describe the horror, as it would be censored by your officer and would only terrify your family. So you wrote about the weather, you thanked them for the parcels of socks and cake, and you lied. You said you were fine. Every letter home was a work of fiction, a protective barrier you built around your loved ones to shield them from the truth. Let's think about the end of the war for the landscape. The guns fell silent, but the land was dead. The soil was so heavily polluted with metal, chemicals, and human remains that it was toxic. In many places, nothing would grow for years. The ground was a mangled, lumpy ruin, but slowly nature began to reclaim it. Grass and wildflowers, especially poppies, began to grow on the disturbed earth. The poppy, which thrived in the lime-rich soil churned up by the shelling, became the enduring symbol of the war. Its bright red flower was a splash of life in a landscape of death, a symbol of both remembrance and the slow, patient healing of the natural world. Finally, let's circle back to you, the hypothetical survivor. You have endured it all. You go home, you try to build a life, you get married, have children. But the war is always there. A loud noise in the street, like a car backfiring, might cause you to instinctively dive for cover. A certain smell might trigger a vivid, unwanted memory. You are reluctant to talk about your experiences because you know no one can understand. You are a member of a secret club that you never wanted to join. You survived, yes, but survival was not a victory. It was simply the beginning of a different, quieter, and much longer battle. A battle against memory. A battle you would fight for the rest of your life. Let's explore the world of the stretcher bearers in more detail. These men, often conscientious objectors who refused to kill but still wanted to serve, had one of the most harrowing jobs. They were part of the Royal Army Medical Corps, and their symbol, the Red Cross, was supposed to grant them protection under the Geneva Convention. In reality, they were often shot at, shelled, and gassed, just like any other soldier. Their work began when the fighting was at its most intense. They would venture into the hell of no man's land, unarmed, to find the wounded. They would perform basic first aid under fire, and then begin the grueling task of carrying a man on a stretcher back across the broken, muddy ground. Their bravery was quiet, sustained, and immense. Consider the food parcels from home. They were a godsend. While the army rations were monotonous and barely adequate, a parcel from home was a treasure chest of luxuries. It might contain a cake, a tin of fruit, chocolate, or a jar of jam. These items were more valuable than gold. They were a taste of home, a tangible expression of love from a faraway family. A soldier would often share the contents of his parcel with his closest friends, the act of sharing strengthening the bonds of comradeship. The arrival of a food parcel was a moment of pure joy and a vital boost to morale, a delicious, edible reminder of the world you were hoping to return to. Let's delve into the trench newspapers, like the famous Wipers Times, named for the British soldiers' mispronunciation of Ypres. These were not official army publications. They were written, edited, and printed by the soldiers themselves, often on salvaged printing presses found in ruined towns. They were filled with an incredible wit and black humor. They contained satirical poems, fake advertisements for things like barbed wire for sale, ideal for training carrier pigeons, and mock theatrical reviews of the latest enemy shelling. These newspapers were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They were a way of laughing in the face of death, of using intelligence and humor as a weapon against the soul-crushing despair of the war. Let's talk about the walking wounded. After an attack, you would see them making their own way back from the front line. They were the lucky ones who had been wounded but were still able to walk. They would come in a steady stream, their uniforms torn and bloody, their faces blank with shock. Some would have their arms in makeshift slings. Others would have bloody bandages wrapped around their heads. They rarely spoke. They just shuffled along, like zombies heading for the aid posts in the rear. They were a grim procession, a living, moving display of the human cost of a few hundred yards of gained or lost ground. For the soldiers moving up to the front, passing this stream of broken men was a terrifying preview of what might be in store for them. Consider the role of observation balloons. These were large, gas-filled balloons that were tethered several miles behind the lines. An observer would sit in a small wicker basket suspended beneath the balloon, using powerful binoculars to spot enemy positions and direct artillery fire. It was a lonely and incredibly dangerous job. The balloons were large, static targets, and they were the favorite prey of enemy fighter pilots, who would attack them with incendiary bullets. The observer's only means of escape was a parachute, which was a new and unreliable technology. They were known as, quote, sausage busters, and the men who flew in them had nerves of steel. Let's think about the first time you saw a tank up close. As a British soldier, you might have felt a sense of awe and power, but you would also have seen its limitations. These early Mark I tanks were mechanical nightmares. They broke down constantly. The inside was a hot, noisy, fume-filled hell. The crew of 8 men were crammed into a tiny space with a massive engine, breathing in carbon monoxide and cordite fumes. The noise was so loud that they had to communicate with hand signals. The heat was intense, and they were a prime target for enemy artillery. While they were a terrifying sight to the enemy, being part of a tank crew was one of the most unpleasant and dangerous jobs of the war. Let's explore the informal art of scrounging. The official Army supply chain was often slow and inadequate. To survive and maintain a basic level of comfort, you had to become an expert scrounger. This meant liberating extra food from the cookhouse, finding discarded timber to improve your dugout, or trading for cigarettes or dry socks. It was a necessary skill. The men who were good at it, who knew how to find and acquire the things they needed, were valuable members of any platoon. Scrounging was a small act of rebellion against the system, a way of taking your survival and comfort into your own hands. The concept of shell hole discipline was a grim one. After an attack, small groups of survivors might find themselves isolated in a large shell hole in no man's land, cut off from their unit. An officer or a senior NCO would have to take command, organize a defense, tend to the wounded, and try to hold the position until nightfall or until they could be relieved. These small, isolated pockets of resistance were a microcosm of the entire war. The men in them had to endure thirst, fear, and further shelling, their survival depending on their discipline and their trust in each other. Many of these small groups were simply wiped out, their stories untold. Let's consider the specific sound of the gas alarm. It was designed to be unmistakable and to provoke an immediate reaction. It could be a loud mechanical horn, a clanging bell, or a large wooden rattle that made a loud, clacking noise. The moment you heard it, your training was supposed to take over. You were taught to stop breathing, close your eyes, put on your gas mask, and only then resume breathing. The speed of this drill was the difference between life and death. The sound of that alarm, cutting through the noise of battle, was one of the most fear-inducing sounds on the front. It signaled the arrival of a silent, invisible killer. Let's reflect on the moment of victory, November 11, 1918. The armistice is signed. The war is won. But for you, the soldier at the front, the feeling was not one of triumphant celebration. It was one of profound, weary relief. You had survived. That was the only victory that mattered. There was also a deep melancholy. You thought of the friends who were not there to see this day. You looked out at the shattered landscape, the graveyard of your youth, and you felt the immense weight of the cost. The celebrations were for the people back home, for the civilians who did not understand. For you, the end of the war was a quiet, somber, and deeply personal moment of closure. Let's discuss the concept of battlefield clearance after the war. The fighting stopped, but the front was a vast scrapyard of military hardware and a cemetery for millions. For years after the armistice, special units were tasked with the gruesome job of clearing the old battlefields. They located and dismantled unexploded shells and grenades, a highly dangerous task. They also had the solemn duty of locating and identifying the remains of the dead. They would search the churned-up earth for bodies, for fragments of uniforms, for identity discs. These remains were then reinterred in the vast, immaculate military cemeteries that now dot the landscape of France and Belgium. It was a long, slow, and heartbreaking process of trying to bring order and dignity to a place of unimaginable chaos and death. Consider the psychological impact of the steel helmet. The British Brodie helmet, a shallow, dish-shaped piece of steel, was designed primarily to protect against shrapnel falling from above. It offered little protection from direct rifle or machine gun fire. But its psychological value was immense. It was a piece of armor, however inadequate. It made you feel slightly less vulnerable. But it also marked you as a soldier. It was a part of the uniform that dehumanized you, turning your individual face into the anonymous silhouette of a Tommy. It was both a comfort and a constant reminder of your role as a cog in the war machine, a faceless soldier whose life was expendable. Let's talk about the specific misery of a gas mask. Wearing it for an extended period was a form of sensory deprivation and torture. Your vision was severely restricted by the small, fogged-up eyepieces. Your hearing was muffled. Your breathing was labored and difficult through the filter, and you were constantly rebreathing your own hot, stale air. The smell of rubber and chemicals was nauseating. Communication was almost impossible. You were isolated in your own personal claustrophobic hell. A unit that had to fight while wearing gas masks was severely handicapped, its effectiveness drastically reduced. The mask might save you from the gas, but it made you a more vulnerable and less effective soldier in every other way. The role of the divisional concert parties, or dump shows, was vital for morale. These were troops of talented soldiers who would put on variety shows for the men in the rest areas. They would perform comedy sketches, sing popular songs, and often feature female impersonators, as there were no women at the front. These shows were a raucous, joyous escape from the grim reality of the war. For a few hours you could laugh, sing along, and forget where you were. The humor was often specific to the soldiers' experience, with jokes about the food, the officers, and the lice that would have been incomprehensible to a civilian audience. These shows were a testament to the enduring power of entertainment and laughter, even in the darkest of times. Let's explore the phenomenon of trench fever. This was a debilitating illness, similar to influenza, that was transmitted by the bite of the lice that infested every soldier's uniform. It was not usually fatal, but it caused high fever, severe headaches, and debilitating pain in the legs and back. It could put a soldier out of action for weeks, or even months. It was another enemy that you couldn't see or fight. It was a constant threat, born from the filth you were forced to live in. An outbreak of trench fever could sweep through a platoon, weakening it as effectively as an enemy attack. It was a miserable, grinding illness that added another layer of suffering to your daily existence. Consider the strange etiquette of no man's land. There were unwritten rules. For example, it was generally considered bad form to shoot at the enemy's stretcher bearers, though it did happen. There were often informal truces to allow both sides to recover their wounded after an attack. These small acts of mutual respect were a fragile attempt to impose a sliver of a moral code on a fundamentally immoral situation. They were a recognition that the man on the other side was in the same boat, and that a small amount of compassion could be mutually beneficial. These truces were a silent rebellion of the frontline soldiers against the total war mentality of the high command. Let's talk about the specific fear of fire. The use of flamethrowers, or Flammenwerfer by the Germans, was a source of primal terror. A soldier armed with this weapon could project a jet of burning oil for a considerable distance, engulfing a section of trench in a roaring inferno. The death it caused was horrific, but the psychological impact was even greater. The sight and sound of the flamethrower in action could cause panic and break the morale of even seasoned troops. It was another example of how the war's technology was designed not just to kill, but to terrify, to attack the mind as much as the body. The importance of a souvenir went beyond simple collecting. For many soldiers, it was a way of proving their experience. A German helmet or a piece of shrapnel was a tangible piece of evidence that you had been there, that you had faced the danger and survived. It was a story you could tell without using words. When you sent it home, it became a part of the family lore. But for the soldier, it was also a way of processing the trauma. By possessing a piece of the battlefield, you exerted a form of control over it. You turned an object of fear into an object of curiosity, a way of containing the chaotic and terrifying experience in a small, manageable form. Let's think about the soldiers who were executed for cowardice. Over 300 British and Commonwealth soldiers were shot at dawn by their own side during the war. Many of these men were not cowards. They were suffering from severe, undiagnosed shell shock. They were boys, some as young as 17, who had been psychologically shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. They were tried by court-martial, with little understanding of their mental condition, and sentenced to death pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others. This practice is now seen as one of the great injustices of the war, a brutal and tragic failure to understand the devastating impact of the conflict on the human mind. Let's return finally to the mud. It was more than an inconvenience. It was a malevolent entity. It had a sound, a constant sucking and squelching noise as men tried to walk through it. It had a smell, a foul odor of decay. And it had a texture, a thick, greasy, and incredibly sticky consistency. It could pull a man's boots off his feet. It could swallow a mule or even a field gun whole. Men who fell off the duckboards at night could drown in it, their struggles only serving to pull them deeper. The mud of the Western Front, particularly at Passchendaele, was the perfect symbol of the war itself, a stagnant, filthy, all-consuming morass that swallowed men, machines, and hope without a trace. Let's consider the role of photography. Official war photographers were tasked with capturing images for propaganda purposes, showing brave, smiling soldiers and the successes of the army. But many soldiers had their own small, portable cameras, like the Kodak vest pocket. They took candid, personal snapshots of their daily lives, their friends in the trench, the ruins of a village, a captured German dugout. These unofficial photographs provide a raw, intimate, and unfiltered view of the war. They show the boredom, the exhaustion, and the camaraderie in a way that the official images never could. They are a quiet, visual testimony to the reality of the soldier's experience. Let's talk about the specific danger of Stand To. This was the order given at dawn and dusk every day when an attack was considered most likely. The entire trench would be manned, with every soldier on the fire step, bayonet fixed, staring out into the gloom of no man's land. It was a period of maximum tension. Your senses were on high alert. Your heart would pound in your chest as you waited for the whistle that might signal an enemy attack, or the order from your own officer to go over the top. It was a ritual of collective anxiety, a twice-daily confrontation with the very real possibility of imminent, violent death. The field dressing was a soldier's first and often only line of medical defense. It was a simple packet of sterile gauze and a bandage that every soldier carried in a special pocket of his tunic. You were taught how to use it on yourself or a comrade. If you were wounded, the first thing you would do, if you were able, was to get out your field dressing and cover the wound to stop the bleeding and prevent infection. This small, simple item was a symbol of your self-reliance and the harsh reality of the front. Professional medical help was far away. In the first critical moments, you were on your own. Let's explore the complex feelings about the enemy. While propaganda painted them as monsters, the frontline soldier's view was often more nuanced. You developed a grudging respect for the soldier in the trench opposite you. You knew he was enduring the same miserable conditions, the same shelling, the same fear. You might hate him in the heat of battle, but in the quiet moments, you saw him as a fellow professional, a fellow sufferer. This was especially true of the machine gunners. You feared and hated the machine gun, but you also respected the skill and bravery of the men who operated it, knowing they were a prime target for your own artillery. Let's consider the specific challenges faced by soldiers in the Salonika campaign or in Mesopotamia. While the Western Front is the most iconic image of the war, British and Commonwealth soldiers fought in many other theaters. In the Balkans or the Middle East, the enemy was not just the opposing army. It was the extreme heat, the tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery, and the difficult, mountainous terrain. These forgotten fronts had their own unique brands of suffering. The soldiers there often felt isolated and forgotten, fighting a sideshow to the main event in France, but their sacrifice and their endurance were no less real. The relationship with chaplains or padres was often one of quiet respect. These men were unarmed, but they shared the dangers of the front line. They would move through the trenches, offering a kind word, a cigarette, or just a moment of human connection. Their biggest role was often after a battle, when they would help bury the dead and write the difficult letters home to the families. They were a moral compass in a world that had lost its way. Many soldiers who were not religious still respected the padre for his bravery and his compassion, seeing him as a symbol of a kinder, more humane world that had been left behind. Let's talk about the specific sound of a sniper's bullet. Unlike the whistle of an artillery shell, a sniper's bullet was faster than the speed of sound. This meant you didn't hear it coming. The first thing you would hear was the sharp crack as the bullet passed you. If you were the target, you would never hear it at all. This made snipers a particularly terrifying and insidious threat. The danger was invisible and unpredictable. It could come at any moment, from any direction. It created a constant, low-level paranoia, forcing you to learn the landscape of your trench, to know every safe and every dangerous spot. The concept of trench raiding was a key part of trench warfare. It was not a full-scale attack, but a small, targeted operation, usually carried out at night by a handful of men. The objectives were to capture a prisoner for interrogation, to destroy an enemy machine gun post, or simply to disrupt the enemy and maintain an aggressive spirit. These were brutal, silent affairs, fought with clubs, knives, and grenades. The men who volunteered for trench raids were a special breed, often a mix of the bravest and the most reckless soldiers. It was high-stakes, high-risk work that required immense courage and skill. Let's consider the physical and emotional toll on the nurses who worked in the casualty clearing stations. These women worked incredibly long hours in horrific conditions, surrounded by death and catastrophic injury. They saw the true cost of the war, the shattered bodies and broken minds that the propaganda posters never showed. They had to be both compassionate and incredibly tough, providing comfort to the dying while performing demanding medical tasks. The war took a heavy toll on them, both physically and emotionally, and their contribution to the war effort, though often overlooked, was immense. Finally, let's think about your identity as a survivor in the years after the war. You became part of a vast fraternity of veterans. You would attend regimental dinners and Armistice Day parades. These were moments of shared remembrance, the only times you could be with people who truly understood what you had been through. There was a comfort in this shared experience, but also a sadness. You were defined by those few years of your youth. The war, which you had been so desperate to survive and escape, had become the most significant event of your life, a shadow that stretched over all the peaceful years that followed. Let us analyze the simple act of receiving a parcel of socks. It sounds trivial, but in the trenches, it was a matter of life and death. Dry socks were the primary defense against trench foot. The socks you were issued would quickly become soaked and useless. A fresh, dry pair, knitted by a loving hand back home, was a treasure. The feeling of peeling off a pair of cold, wet, muddy socks and pulling on a warm, dry pair was a moment of pure, unadulterated pleasure. It was a small but profound comfort that could lift your spirits and, more importantly, save your feet from rot and gangrene. These parcels of socks were parcels of love and health. Consider the trench code. This was an unwritten set of rules and behaviors that governed life on the front. It was about sharing your food, taking your turn on sentry duty without complaint, and never, ever touching another man's personal mail. It was about trusting the man next to you with your life. This code was the bedrock of comradeship. It was a moral system, created by the soldiers themselves, in the absence of a meaningful one from the outside world. To break the trench code was to become an outcast, to lose the trust of the men on whom your survival depended. It was a more powerful and immediate law than any military regulation. Let's talk about the specific fear of no man's land at night. It was not an empty space. It was populated by the dead, by listening posts, and by patrols from both sides. But it was also populated by your own imagination. Every sound, every shadow was a potential threat. The decomposing bodies of the dead would make noises as gases escaped, sounding like a human groan. The wind would rustle the barbed wire, sounding like it was being cut. Your mind, already stretched to the breaking point by fear and exhaustion, would play tricks on you. The psychological strain of peering into that darkness, night after night, was immense. The role of animals as mascots was a common feature of trench life. A platoon or a company might adopt a stray dog, a cat, or even more exotic animals like a monkey or a goat. These animals provided a much-needed distraction and a source of affection in a world that was otherwise harsh and brutal. They were a reminder of a gentler, more normal life. They were often doted on by the soldiers, who would share their meager rations with them. The mascot was a symbol of the unit's identity and a source of comfort, a small, living creature that was innocent of the human madness surrounding it. Let's examine the first moments of a gas attack. It began not with a bang, but with a faint, unusual smell, and the hiss of the gas cylinders being opened in the enemy trenches. Then you would see it, a low, creeping cloud of yellow, green, or white mist, drifting slowly towards you on the wind. The panic was instant. Shouts of "Gas! Gas!" would echo down the trench. You would fumble for your mask, your heart pounding. The terrifying thing about gas was its silence and its patience. It would seep into every corner of the trench, every dugout, hunting you. It was an enemy you couldn't shoot, an enemy you could only try to outlast. Let's consider the disillusionment that set in as the war dragged on. In 1914, you might have enlisted out of a sense of patriotic duty and adventure. By 1917, after the slaughter of the Somme and Passchendaele, that idealism was gone. It was replaced by a grim, weary cynicism. You were no longer fighting for king and country, or for the war to end all wars. You were fighting to survive and to protect the men next to you. You saw the war for what it was, a vast, pointless, industrial slaughter managed by incompetent generals who were safe in the rear. This disillusionment was a deep, corrosive wound to the spirit. The importance of the bloody wound fantasy had a direct impact on how soldiers viewed their own bodies. You became acutely aware of your own physical form as a collection of parts that could be damaged. You would fantasize about a perfect wound, a clean shot through the fleshy part of the arm or leg, enough to get you sent home, but not enough to cause a permanent disability. You would hear of a friend getting such a wound and feel a surge of envy, not pity. This grim calculation, this hope for a life-altering injury, was a measure of how desperate you were to escape. Your own physical harm became preferable to the certainty of continued psychological torment and likely death. Let's talk about the specific experience of being in a hospital train. If you were wounded badly enough, you would be evacuated from the casualty clearing station on a specially equipped train. These journeys were often long and agonizing. You would be lying on a stretcher in a cramped, swaying carriage with dozens of other wounded men. The train would jolt and bump, sending waves of pain through your injured body. The nurses on board did their best, but they were overwhelmed. The smell of antiseptic and death was overpowering. It was a journey through a landscape of pain, your only comfort being the knowledge that every mile was a mile further from the front. The class system of Britain was replicated, and in some ways challenged by the war. The officers were almost exclusively from the upper and middle classes, while the enlisted men were from the working class. There was a huge social gulf between them. But in the shared misery of the trenches, these barriers began to break down. A good officer earned the respect of his men, not through his social standing, but through his bravery and his willingness to share their hardships. The war forced men from all walks of life into an intimate life-or-death relationship, creating a sense of national unity and shared experience that had not existed before. Let's conclude by reflecting on the silence. After 4.5 years of relentless, deafening noise, the silence that fell on November 11, 1918, was the most profound sound of all. It was a heavy physical presence. For the soldier at the front, it was deeply unsettling. Your body and mind were conditioned to the noise. The silence felt unnatural, wrong. In that silence, you could finally hear the birds again. You could hear the wind. You could hear your own thoughts. And in those thoughts, you began to process the sheer, overwhelming scale of what you had just been through. The war was over, but its echo would reverberate in that silence for the rest of your life. Let's analyze the visual landscape of the support trenches. These were a few hundred yards behind the front line and served as the secondary line of defense. They were a hub of activity. Here you would find the entrances to the deeper command dugouts and aid posts. Men would be cleaning their rifles, writing letters, or trying to cook over small, smokeless fires. It was marginally safer than the front line, but still well within range of enemy artillery. The atmosphere was one of tense waiting. You were either preparing to go up to the front line or had just come back, still shaking from the experience. It was a purgatory, a halfway house between the hell of the front and the relative safety of the rear. Consider the job of the Royal Engineers, the sappers. These were the technical specialists of the Army. Their work was incredibly varied and dangerous. They were responsible for building and maintaining the trenches, the bridges, and the roads. They were in charge of the water supply and sanitation. They were also the experts in demolition and mining warfare, planting the huge mines that would obliterate enemy positions. They often had to work in the most exposed and dangerous locations, under direct enemy fire. Their motto was "Ubik," meaning everywhere, a testament to their presence in every aspect of the war. Their technical skill was essential to the functioning of the entire army. Let's talk about the specific sensation of an artillery shell landing nearby. It was not just a sound, it was a full-body experience. The concussion wave would hit you like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of you. The ground would heave and shake as if in an earthquake. The air would be filled with the acrid smell of high explosives. Your ears would ring, and you would be temporarily deafened. You would be covered in a shower of dirt and debris. To survive a near miss was to be violently reminded of your own fragility. It was a visceral, terrifying experience that left you shaking and disoriented, your nerves completely shot. The role of religion and superstition coexisted in the trenches. Many soldiers carried a Bible or a crucifix, finding comfort in their faith. But they also carried lucky charms, a rabbit's foot, a special coin, a photograph of a loved one. They would develop personal rituals that they believed kept them safe, like always putting on their left boot first. In a world governed by random chance, these superstitions were an attempt to impose some sense of order or control. You would cling to whatever you thought might give you an edge, whether it was a prayer to God or a lucky penny in your pocket. In the face of death, you would take help from wherever you could get it. Let's look at the tin can grenade. Early in the war, proper grenades were in short supply. Soldiers would improvise their own, the most famous being the jam tin bomb. This was simply an empty jam tin filled with explosives and scraps of metal. with a fuse that had to be lit with a match or a cigarette. They were unreliable and dangerous to the user, with fuses that could be too fast or too slow. The evolution from these crude homemade devices to the sophisticated, time-fused Mills bomb was a microcosm of the war itself, a rapid, deadly progression in the technology of killing. Consider the experience of being wounded in the stomach. This was one of the most feared injuries. Before the development of modern surgery and antibiotics, a stomach wound was almost always a death sentence. The bullet or shrapnel would tear through the intestines, causing massive internal bleeding and releasing bacteria into the abdominal cavity. This would lead to peritonitis, a massive, painful infection. The victim would die a slow, agonizing death over several days. Soldiers knew this, and the fear of this particular wound was a constant, nagging presence in the back of their minds. Let's talk about the specific challenge of fighting in a ruined village. Places like Ypres or the villages on the Somme were fought over for months until they were completely destroyed. The fighting here was different from the open trenches. It was a chaotic, three-dimensional battle amidst piles of rubble, in the cellars of destroyed houses, and in fortified ruins. It was a sniper's paradise and a disorienting labyrinth for the attacking soldiers. Every pile of bricks could conceal a machine gun. Every darkened doorway could hide an enemy soldier. It was a grim, urban warfare that was often even more deadly and confusing than the trenches. The concept of the enemy became increasingly abstract. For the first few months, you might have felt a personal hatred for the Germans. But as the war of attrition dragged on, that feeling often faded. You rarely saw the enemy as an individual. You saw him as a distant, khaki-colored figure, or not at all. You were fighting not a person, but a position on a map. The real, tangible enemies were the mud, the cold, the rats, the lice, and the ever-present shelling. Fritz was just another poor soul, trapped in the same machine, suffering in a trench a few hundred yards away. Your hatred was redirected towards the war itself, and the generals who kept it going. Let's think about the role of the military police, the Red Caps. They were generally despised by the frontline soldiers. Their job was to enforce discipline, to man the checkpoints behind the lines, and to hunt down deserters. To the combat soldier who had just come back from the hell of the front line, being harassed by a military policeman for having a dirty uniform or an incorrect pass was infuriating. They were seen as shirkers who had a safe job in the rear and who lorded their authority over the men who were doing the real fighting. They were a symbol of the petty, bureaucratic side of the army that the soldiers loathed. Let's end with the legacy of your survival. You returned home, but you brought the war with you in countless small ways. You might find it impossible to stand in a queue, the feeling of being in a line of men triggering a deep-seated anxiety. You might overreact to small frustrations with a sudden, violent anger that shocked your family. You might find yourself emotionally distant, unable to connect with your wife and children, because you had built a wall around your feelings to survive. These were the invisible wounds, the echoes of the trenches that shaped the rest of your life, and the lives of those who loved you. Survival was not an endpoint. It was the start of a lifelong negotiation with the past. Let's analyze the critical role of the humble shovel. It was as important as your rifle. The phrase, "the infantryman's best friend," was often applied to it. Your life depended on your ability to dig. You dug trenches, you dug latrines, you dug graves. When you were caught in the open under shell fire, you would desperately try to dig a shallow scrape in the ground to give yourself some cover. A sharpened shovel could also be a fearsome weapon in the close-quarters combat of a trench raid. The shovel was the primary tool you used to shape your environment, to create a fragile bubble of safety in a world designed to kill you. It was a tool of both survival and, when necessary, of brutal combat. Consider the phenomenon of trench magazines. These were not just the famous humor magazines, they were also serious literary journals. Publications like The Hydra, edited by the poet Wilfred Owen from Craiglockhart War Hospital, were places where soldiers could process their trauma through writing. They published poetry and prose that explored the psychological impact of the war with a raw honesty. These magazines were a form of collective therapy, a way for these men to articulate the unspeakable and to find a shared language for their experiences. They are a powerful testament to the human need to create meaning and art, even in the most horrific of circumstances. Let's talk about the specific danger of the dud shell. Not every artillery shell that was fired exploded. A significant number were duds. They would thud into the ground and lie there, inert but still filled with high explosives. These unexploded shells were a constant hazard. A stray bullet could set one off. A soldier digging a new trench could hit one with his shovel. They littered the battlefield, turning the very ground into a minefield. The fear of a dud shell, which had been silent and harmless for weeks, suddenly coming to life, was another layer of anxiety that soldiers had to live with every day. The importance of tea was central to the British soldiers' experience. It was a ritual, a comfort, a taste of home. A hot, sweet, milky cup of tea could work wonders for morale. Units would go to great lengths to get the Dixies, large cauldrons of tea, up to the front line, even under fire. The act of brewing up, even on a small, smoky fire in a dugout, was a moment of normalcy. It was a pause, a chance to gather your thoughts and share a moment of quiet comradeship. In the cold, damp misery of the trenches, the warmth and sweetness of a cup of tea was a small but profound pleasure that helped make the unbearable, briefly, bearable. Let's explore the complex emotions of a bloody wound from the perspective of the wounded man. You feel a searing pain in your leg. Your first thought might not be fear, but a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. You've made it. You've got your ticket home. But this joy is quickly complicated by other emotions. There is the agony of the wound itself. There is the fear of the long, dangerous journey to the hospital. And there is a profound sense of guilt. You are leaving your friends, your comrades behind. You are escaping, while they have to stay and face the horror. The bloody wound was a cocktail of relief, pain, and guilt, a perfect metaphor for the morally confusing world of the trenches. Consider the specific sound of the battlefield at night. It was not silent. It was a symphony of strange and terrifying noises. There was the constant, nervous coughing of men in the trenches. There was the scuttling of the rats. There was the groan of the earth, settling after a shelling. There was the eerie flapping of a piece of canvas in the wind. And then there were the human sounds from no man's land, the low moans of the wounded and the dying. This nocturnal soundscape was a constant source of psychological stress, a reminder that even in the darkness, there was no peace and no true safety. Let's talk about the first time you returned to the front after being on leave. It was one of the most difficult things a soldier had to do. You had just spent a few days in a world of clean sheets, good food, and safety. You had been reminded of what a normal life felt like. Now, you had to voluntarily walk back into hell. The dread on the journey back was a heavy, physical thing. You knew exactly what was waiting for you. The sight of the shelled landscape, the sound of the guns, the smell of the trenches. It was all sickeningly familiar. This return journey was a test of will, a forced march from a dream back into a nightmare. The relationship with the sky was one of constant vigilance. You learned to read the clouds, not for rain, but for the direction of the wind, which would determine the threat of a gas attack. You learned to identify the silhouettes of different aircraft. An enemy reconnaissance plane meant you should take cover. An Allied fighter plane might mean a momentary distraction. The sky was not a symbol of freedom, it was a source of danger. It was the pathway for the artillery shells, the bombs, and the gas that rained down on you. You learned to be wary of open spaces, to prefer the claustrophobic but comforting cover of the trench. Let's analyze the process of hardening. A new soldier was soft. He was shocked by the sights and sounds. He was sentimental. To survive, you had to harden. You had to become numb to the death and the horror around you. You had to learn to suppress your emotions, to see a dead body and feel nothing. This hardening was a necessary psychological armor, but it came at a cost. It created a distance between you and your own humanity. The man who survived the war was often a man who had learned to kill a part of himself, the part that felt too much. This was a wound that was deeper and more permanent than any physical injury. Finally, let's consider the legacy of your story. You, the survivor, became a living witness. Your presence at the family table, your silences, your nightmares, your physical and emotional scars, they were a testament to the truth of the war. You might not have spoken about it, but your life told the story. You were the uncomfortable reminder of the true cost of the glorious war. Your survival was not a happy ending. It was a complex, difficult, and lifelong epilogue. And it is in understanding the depth and complexity of that epilogue that we move beyond the simple, romantic lie and begin to grasp the profound, empathetic, and terrible reality of what it truly meant to be a soldier in the Great War.